In this video, let's understand why property taxes are skyrocketing in the US. And there is no better place to explore this topic than the state of Florida. Florida has a well-developed real estate market that has a strong effect on the state's economy. Lately, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, made a proposal. He wants to tackle the surging tax burden on Floridians.
You also have at the local level property taxes. And while we do have things like homestead exemption, which helps softens the blow, the reality is we're not even in the top 20 when it comes to property taxes. And we need to change that. We need to make sure that we're giving taxpayers relief when it comes to property taxes.
Can Ron DeSantis succeed? And are there pros and cons to his proposal? Here's the issue. Property taxes have jumped around the US, but in Florida this has been a key issue since 2020, and the culprit was rising home values. Many people moved to Florida for its less restrictive COVID response, no income taxes, and warm climate. If we look at the average home value from Zillow, here's what we see. The US average prices jumped from roughly $247,000 to $361,000, a 46% increase from 2020 to now. A similar picture arises from Florida. Home values in the Sunshine State shot up from $249,000 to $387,000. That's a 55% increase, which is about 9% higher than the national average. If we look at the Consumer Price Index or CPI, it went up by 24% over the same period. CPI does account for the cost of housing, but housing makes up about 1/3 of the CPI. In other words, while prices are up for Americans, housing inflation was more than 2 times of CPI in Florida. If we look at property taxes in Florida, 94% of them come from real estate. The remaining 6% are from personal property like boats and cars. As home values went up, property taxes followed. The property tax per capita was steadily creeping up before the pandemic, but there has been a dramatic jump since then. From 2021 to 2023, property tax per capita grew by almost 10% each year. That's high by historical norms. After 2023, home inflation slowed down in Florida. If we compare Florida property tax rate to the national average, it's actually not the highest. At 0.74%, Florida ranks somewhere in the middle of the pack. But if we look at property tax collection per capita in Florida, it stands at $2,000, almost $15 in 2023. The national average was $1,890. So Florida's property tax collections are higher than the US average. That was not the case before 2020. Median household income in Florida is about $72,000, compared to the national average of about $81,000. In other words, not only incomes in Florida are lower, but also its property tax burden is higher compared to the national average. The problem gets even worse. Florida has a higher proportion of older people living there. The percentage of older folks at 65 and older in Florida is about 22%, compared to the national average of 18%. Many retirees live on a fixed income, and hence they feel more pain from higher property taxes compared to, say, a working household with a growing income. Many Floridians brought this issue up to DeSantis' attention.
And retired Tampa resident, and we pay $529 a month towards our property taxes. That's a huge sum of money for someone who's on a fixed income. And what does an individual do when something impacts your budget? You look for ways to reduce your expenditures, which is what we did. So we don't have cable anymore, and we changed our phone plan, and we took the excruciating step of going from 2 cars to 1. Trust me. It's a traumatic experience.
As it stands now, here's how property tax exemptions work in Florida for its residents. The first $25,000 of home value are 100% tax-free. The second $25,000 of home value gets taxed at a regular tax rate. The next $25,000 between $50,000 and $75,000 of home value is also exempt from property taxes, except for school board taxes. And that's a catch. Depending on the county, school board taxes can be significant. This lowers the exemption from $50,000 to almost $39,000 according to Florida's Senator Blaise Ingoglia. On top of it, there's the so-called Save Our Homes assessment limitation. For residents, it caps increases on home value assessments to 3% or CPI inflation, whichever is less. There are also veteran and early payment discounts. When it comes to the cost of each exemption, here's a table from Florida Policy Institute. It shows that property tax relief in Florida cost $32 billion this year. Save Our Homes assessment limitation is the most expensive. It cost over $14 billion to Florida counties. Veteran discounts and the first $25,000 exemption on homestead properties follow. The second $25,000 homestead exemption is the least costly. This is so since probably there are houses that cost less than $75,000. Plus, don't forget that school board exemption on exemption we talked about. Florida has exemptions for non-residents too. These exemptions do help lower income families owning a small, less expensive homes. But the problem is that these homestead exemptions were adopted a long time ago, and back then the home came with a price tag much lower than what it is today. The median home price today in Florida is about $420,000, and this $25,000 homestead exemption covers about 6% of that home median value. And the thing is that this coverage percentage was much higher before, even before 2020. And to be fair, Floridians did vote and approve Amendment 5 last year. This amendment added an annual inflation adjustment to the homestead exemption. But the problem is that this inflation adjustment only applies to the second $25,000 homestead exemption. And the indexing happens at the CPI rate, not home inflation rate. And as we saw before, the housing inflation can grow at a faster clip compared to the CPI. Also, the Save Our Homes limitation caps assessed values to 3% a year or CPI. But when home prices spiked more than 5 or 10% a year, even these exemptions may not be enough. The thing is that this limitation applies only if you continue living in your home. If you move, sell your home and buy a new one, you get locked into a higher assessed value and hence higher property tax. This becomes a keen problem when household incomes do not keep up with the rising home prices. So, what's the solution that Ron DeSantis proposes? Here are his words.
We need to make sure that we're delivering property tax relief. I propose to do relief this year, but then parlay that into a ballot initiative that would allow Floridians to be able to own their home without having to pay rent to the government. I mean, wouldn't that be great?
DeSantis proposed repeal or some form of property tax relief to full-time residents of Florida. But here's an issue. The thing is that property taxes represent an important component of counties' revenues in Florida. Here's a breakdown of revenue sources for a typical Florida county. We see that taxes and charges for services account for almost 60% of all revenues. If we look at where tax revenue comes from, we see that over 70% of all tax collections are property taxes. The remainder resides in sales taxes and other miscellaneous tax charges. So, property taxes make up about 18% of county revenues. But remember those school board property taxes that are earmarked for education? Those make up about 50 to 60% of school district revenues, according to the Florida Policy Institute. So, property tax is an important component to fund schools on a county level. Florida Policy Institute estimates that repealing property taxes results in a $43 billion shortfall. That's over $2,000 per capita. Of course, this $43 billion assumes 100% elimination of property taxes for everyone. I believe this is not what DeSantis proposes. So the shortfall will probably be below $43 billion. How much exactly, nobody knows. The data is not easy to find. Let's assume that property taxes will get repealed for full-time residents. And this will cost anywhere under $40 billion in lost revenues. And there's no magic wallet to pay for this loss. It will have to come from somewhere. Florida Policy Institute thinks that the most obvious candidate for that is raising sales taxes. Florida is heavily dependent to balance its state budget with sales taxes. With no income tax, consumption tax is the major remaining avenue. The state of Florida gets 60% of its revenues from sales taxes. The US average is around 25%, given that many states impose income taxes. Florida's current sales tax rate is 6%. Also, counties levy their own sales taxes, which could be up to 2%. Doubling Florida's sales tax to 12% would raise the needed $40 billion. That is, this assumes that the consumer demand will remain the same. If consumption falls, you won't get $40 billion almost for sure. There are pros and cons to raising sales taxes to fund property tax relief. First off, a real estate property is always there, while consumption comes and goes. For instance, what if tourists stop coming to Florida in large numbers, and then sales tax revenues will plummet? So, in a sense, real estate property taxes, they provide much better stability to county revenues compared to sales taxes. On top of it, what we are talking about here is the statewide increase in sales taxes, not on a county-based level. Florida's central government would collect sales taxes and then disburse funds to each county as needed. There is a counter-argument to that. Such an arrangement would produce less autonomy for counties. Counties will be more dependent on Florida's central government for fiscal decisions. There's another option for Florida counties, and that is to raise sales taxes on their own. But unfortunately, there are limits to that. The Florida Policy Institute made estimates on that. If counties collect sales tax at maximum rates, they would raise $13.2 billion. Any shortfall beyond that will have to come from somewhere else. Again, the likeliest candidate is statewide sales tax increase. At the same time, DeSantis thinks that there are alternative ways to fund property tax relief. In particular, he proposes to get rid of waste at the county level. Here are his words.
But authorizing a nice, crisp DOGE effort for local governments where you'd have the keys to the kingdom, you'd be able to look at the payments, the contracts, and then publicize this. Because if you look at the budgets, it's very opaque. There may be a line item, you don't know where that money's being funneled, as we've seen with the federal government. It ends up going to all these different places. We have major counties in this state that have had massive expansions of their budgets just in the last 5 or 6 years. And the reason is they're getting more revenue from the property tax. And do those budgets need to grow by that much? I think the answer is probably going to be no.
As property taxes started rolling in, some counties chose to set those money aside for a rainy day fund, but others chose to spend it, whether justified or not. For instance, take Lake County near Orlando. Total taxable value of property there has almost doubled since 2020. The county's annual budget also almost doubled as property tax collections shot up. At the same time, its operating expenditures went up too. For instance, personal services went up by 61%. Operating expenses ballooned by 84%. Lake County's population increased by about 18% since 2020. Even coupled with inflation, these are large budget increases. I don't know enough about this county. It could be that these increases are justified, or maybe not. The thing is that if you're a government official and money keeps rolling in, you can always find a social program to spend on it. But is this program productive or needed at all? And that's a completely different question to answer. Of course, will DOGE efforts find enough ways to fund this property tax relief? We don't know the answer to this question, as the efforts are ongoing. But Ron DeSantis points out that property tax is an anomaly, and here's why.
Property taxes are an anomaly because, they're not voluntary. Consumption taxes are basically voluntary. If I go buy a big screen TV, I'm going to pay tax on it, and I can choose to buy that or not buy that. But you just basically, for subsisting and living on your own property, on your own parcel of land, your own home, particularly people that own it free and clear of any encumbrances, you got to just keep writing a check to the government just for the privilege of using your own property. And that's an anomaly. That's not the way good tax policy should be. It certainly undercuts the idea of private property that you own outside the reach of the government. and you effectively are wards of the local government because you're having to pay rent to them just to be able to exercise your basic rights to own and enjoy property.
So money will have to come from somewhere if DOGE efforts fall short on finding enough money. So what's the alternative? Unsurprisingly, raising sales taxes is one of the few viable options. Higher sales tax may hit low-income residents of Florida, as many point out. But there are some offsetting factors. Florida exempts food, baby products, drugs, and other necessities from sales taxes. The product list is long. Low-income families spend more on necessities compared to wealthier households. So this will help. Also, DeSantis points out that about 40 to 50% of sales tax burden is borne by non-residents.
Because if you think about it, 20% of our sales tax is tourists, but then another big percent are businesses and non-residents. And so a snowbird is not a tourist, right? They're non-residents. They're here 4 months, 5 months of the year, but they're not Florida residents. They pay a lot of it. So really, the Florida residents, in terms of the total sales tax burden, is not a huge percentage. I mean, it may be 50, 60% at most. But just imagine what other state has the primary source of revenue for its government come 40% from non-individual residents of the state, 50% maybe, depending on how you do it. Man, we have such a great opportunity.
Still, even with 50 to 60% of sales tax burden falling on full-time residents, that's significant. If you look around, there is a lot of debate what's better, sales tax or tax on wealth like homes. House is a strange animal. It kind of plays a dual role. On one hand, no doubt it's a store of value and an asset, but at the same time it's a necessity and a shelter, especially for a full-time resident of Florida living in a modest home. So there's an argument to make either way. For instance, you can argue that exempting more homestead value from property tax may make sense. That way full-time residents will get some relief. And Florida can continue taxing non-residents and high-valued homes. Also, economists generally agree that sales tax, which is a form of consumption tax, is less distortionary compared to wealth tax. Taxing real estate too much may discourage investment in housing, as well as discourage people from moving to Florida. At the same time, there were some studies done on the effect of replacing property tax with sales tax. They found that the overall effect in Indiana, for instance, would be around -2 to 3% on the state's output. The research paper assumed full replacement of property taxes with sales taxes. If Florida provides partial relief and continues taxing non-residents, that's a different matter. The overall negative effect on economic output in Florida may be actually negligible. Anyway, it's a complicated argument. Policymakers will have to address and assess it. The tussle between DeSantis and Florida's House of Representatives just began. As a counter, the House proposed reducing Florida's sales tax rate by 0.75%. It's an interesting situation because Republicans hold a supermajority in Florida's House. DeSantis said that this sales tax reduction will kill his efforts to reduce property tax. So he vowed to veto this bill.
Now, they propose to reduce the state sales tax by 3/4 of a penny. And, the issue with that is people, one, are not clamoring for sales tax relief, they're clamoring for property tax relief. So there's no property tax relief in that proposal, but it also allows relief for foreigners. It allows relief for visitors and part-time residents. I think the tax relief needs to be focused on Floridians. We need a Florida first tax package.
Property tax relief will have to go through constitutional amendment in Florida, meaning residents of Florida will have to vote on it. To make it into the 2026 ballot, proposed amendments will have 3 avenues for that. First one is from citizens' signatures, second one is from the state legislature, and the third one is from certain commissions. Currently, Florida's House of Representatives formed a commission. It will study property tax relief. There are 5 proposals under consideration. Here they are. Among them is raising homestead exemption. Also, another proposal will prohibit foreclosures on properties with unpaid property taxes. After that, Florida's legislature may propose constitutional amendment to address this property tax relief. And that is probably the easiest way for this amendment to make its way into the 2026 ballot. But after that, the amendment must get 60% or more of approval from voters. And that's a high bar to clear. There were some attempts to repeal property taxes before. For instance, North Dakota failed to repeal its property taxes in the November elections of last year. Repealing property taxes completely will be a very hard sell to voters. Floridians may get very worried and may reject this proposal if they don't get assurance that firefighters, police, and schools will be properly funded. Likely, some form of partial relief from property taxes will be a much easier sell to voters. On top of it, repealing completely property taxes may have unintended consequences. There could be a flood of demand for Florida's real estate from both consumers and investors alike. So, paradoxically, property tax relief may actually increase home prices in Florida, which will offset it. Overall, Florida is in a strong fiscal position, especially compared to some other states. Since 2019, DeSantis has managed to increase Florida's rainy day fund by $9.4 billion and pay down 41% of its state debt. This has saved millions of dollars in interest expense to taxpayers. The hope is that the good times will continue rolling in. This will give DeSantis and his team an opportunity to find compromise and overhaul property tax laws. That way, Florida's residents may finally get some tax relief. What do you guys think about rising property taxes in Florida and around the US? Let me know in the comments down below. As always, thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe to my channel for more videos on economic topics. With that, all the best, and I will see you in the next one.